Jonas Carmichael had always considered himself an average man, which was precisely why the world hadn't expected much from him. That was until the day he accidentally invented anti-gravity. It all started on an unusually hot Wednesday morning. The sun hung too high in the sky, as if even it had forgotten what it was supposed to do. Jonas, with his wild hair and perpetually untucked shirt, had spent the previous evening arguing with his lab assistant over the most ridiculous of things, whether or not a specific kind of metal could actually float. The argument ended in a minor explosion, a minor fire, and a minor lawsuit from the neighbor who owned the property next door. But none of that mattered at the moment, because Jonas was thinking about something far more important than the pile of legal threats and scorched metal around him. Anti-gravity, he muttered under his breath, pacing the cluttered lab like a man possessed. It's the next step. I can't be the only one thinking of it. No, Jonas wasn't the first to think about it. Everyone had thought about it. But no one had gotten it quite right. There had been experiments, theories, and some very unsuccessful attempts. But Jonas was not about to let failure, or the world's lack of confidence in him, stop him. He'd spent his entire life being underestimated, and now was his chance to prove everyone wrong. The problem was, Jonas wasn't exactly sure how to make anti-gravity work. Not really. But that didn't bother him in the slightest. He had a theory, he always had a theory. The rest of the world called it madness, but Jonas called it thinking outside the box. Or, more accurately, thinking outside the atmosphere. He'd been tinkering with magnets, energy fields, and theories of quantum mechanics for years. He wasn't an expert, but he knew enough to get himself into trouble. This time, he thought he had a breakthrough. He was standing over a magnetic coil when he noticed something peculiar, a faint hum. The hum intensified, growing louder as he fiddled with the knobs and switches. He didn't know what it was, but he could feel it in his gut. Something was about to happen. Then, in a flash of light and a hum so deep it shook the ground, the entire laboratory lifted off the ground. Jonas, startled, scrambled to keep his feet on the floor as the building hovered. The hum turned into a high-pitched whine, and then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. Jonas looked around, eyes wide. His lab was floating in mid-air. Well, he said, blinking, I think I just invented anti-gravity. In the days that followed, Jonas didn't waste time in telling the world about his accidental achievement. The floating lab, his accidental test run, wasn't exactly a stable experiment, but it was proof enough that anti-gravity wasn't just some out-of-reach fantasy. The press got a hold of the story quickly. His accidental genius turned him from a failed inventor into an overnight sensation. By the time he had gotten around to fixing the lab's wiring, Jonas was already fielding interviews and invitations from prominent tech moguls. The world's eyes were suddenly on Jonas Carmichael, and he wasn't ready for it. Jonas was a scientist, not a celebrity, but he couldn't help it. The world had a fascination with the man who had defied the laws of physics. Levitas, the city Jonas had begun building, was born out of this fascination. The idea came to him on another sleepless night, sipping coffee from an old mug that had more cracks than the Grand Canyon. A floating city. Not just a floating building or a floating lab. A city. A place where people could escape Earth's gravity, where they could live above the problems of the world. Levitas was meant to be a utopia, a safe haven for anyone tired of the chaos below, and somehow, against all odds, people believed him. Jonas wasn't sure how he pulled it off, but by the time Levitas was half built, there were already hundreds of people, some curious, some idealistic, and some simply looking for an escape, ready to inhabit the floating city. They signed contracts, traded their earthly possessions for a chance at a life in the sky, and soon, Levitas began to take shape. The city wasn't pretty, not in the traditional sense. The architecture was far from sleek or polished. It was an amalgamation of floating platforms, makeshift buildings, and barely functional streets. The infrastructure was a patchwork of experimental technology, partially powered by Jonas's anti-gravity generator, partially powered by wind turbines, and partially powered by sheer determination. But to the residents of Levitas, it didn't matter. They were free from the dirt, the pollution, the corruption of Earth. They were free, or at least, that's what they thought. Jonas was still figuring out how the whole thing worked, but as the city expanded, his fame grew, too. Levitas became not only a marvel of modern science but a symbol of hope. People called Jonas the Floating Messiah, a title he never wanted but found hard to escape. He had never intended to lead a city. Hell, he could barely manage his own life. But now he was the one they all turned to when things went wrong. And things went wrong often, because Levitas, despite its many virtues, was a disaster waiting to happen. The platform on which Levitas floated was unstable. Jonas had calculated that it would hover just fine, but he had never anticipated how gravity itself would behave in a city this large. At any given moment, a part of Levitas could come close to plummeting back to Earth. Jonas, of course, had no idea how to fix that, and so, in his typical fashion, he just ignored the issue and hoped for the best. Meanwhile, the city was becoming more and more chaotic. The residents were an odd mix of intellectuals, tech enthusiasts, artists, and a few wanderers who had no idea what they were doing, but they had all been lured by Jonas's grand vision. The floating city was full of beautiful dreams, but also full of confusion and absurdity. There were no clear laws, no citywide regulations. And yet, somehow, the residents loved it. They reveled in the chaos, in the strange and unusual. There was a kind of freedom that came with not knowing what was going to happen next. Jonas tried to maintain order, he really did. But he was constantly distracted by his own mounting celebrity, by the interviews, the fan clubs, the tech companies that wanted his anti-gravity generator for themselves. Levitas was starting to look less like a haven and more like a circus, and Jonas wasn't sure how to stop it. One night, after a particularly trying conversation with a reporter who wanted to know about the cultural impact of anti-gravity, Jonas stood at the edge of Levitas, gazing down at the Earth below. It looked peaceful from up here, calm and untouched. But the truth was, the peace of Levitas wasn't what it seemed. There were cracks beneath the surface, cracks in the technology, cracks in the people, and cracks in Jonas's own mind. He didn't know how much longer he could keep it all together. What he didn't know, however, was that while he was busy trying to hold everything together, he was about to catch the attention of someone far beyond the stars. The next morning, Jonas woke up with a headache that felt like a marching band was rehearsing in his skull. He had spent the night trying to figure out the anti-gravity generator's recent hiccups, a technical glitch that made parts of Levitas float a little too high, a little too unpredictably. His mind was clouded, and he couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The last few days had been an endless stream of interviews, photo ops, and the occasional sabotage attempt from disgruntled engineers who didn't quite understand the genius of his design, or perhaps just didn't like the fact that Jonas had, for all intents and purposes, accidentally invented the future. But none of that mattered right now. Not in the face of what he'd seen last night. Jonas had stepped out onto the observation deck before bed, looking down at the sprawling city below. The gravity fields in the city flickered unpredictably, causing the buildings to sway slightly. He tried to dismiss the odd sensation, but it nagged at him. That wasn't what bothered him, though. What bothered him was the faint, almost imperceptible signal he'd picked up on his communications radar. It wasn't from Earth. It wasn't even from the moon. It came from somewhere beyond the stars. Jonas, of course, had thought it was a glitch in the system. He was, after all, no expert in intergalactic communication, but something about the signal felt too precise, too deliberate to be a mistake. It was a frequency unlike any he had encountered before, mathematically perfect, a pattern in the static that called to him like a siren's song. And now, standing in the heart of Levitas, the vast floating city that was somehow still standing, despite his best efforts to make it fall, Jonas realized that his accidental invention had done far more than give him fame. It had turned Levitas into a beacon. And the universe was watching that. He wasn't sure what to make of it, but there was no time to waste. A visit from space wasn't something he could take lightly. By the time he'd thrown on his jacket and walked toward the central command center of Levitas, word had already spread. His assistant, Valerie, who was as practical and grounded as Jonas was wild and unfocused, was already at work, trying to filter through the city's numerous systems. She was good at this sort of thing. Where Jonas saw chaos, she saw patterns, and she had an uncanny ability to solve problems that seemed impossible. "Jonas, we've got something strange happening. You should see this," Valerie said, her voice tense but calm. Jonas followed her into the control room, where a group of engineers were already gathered around a large, flickering screen. The data was flashing rapidly, the kind of data no one had ever thought they'd see. It was the signal. It had gotten stronger, clearer. The source of the transmission was no longer a distant blip. It was coming closer. Jonas stared at the screen, his heart pounding. "What is that?" "It's a ship," Valerie said, her voice steady but laced with disbelief. "An alien ship." Jonas felt the ground beneath his feet shift, even though the platform was supposed to be stable. The air in the room grew heavier, and for a moment, no one spoke. The room felt too small. Too cramped. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jonas said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Are you sure it's not just a satellite, or—" "Jonas," Valerie interrupted. "It's moving. Toward us." Suddenly, the tension in the room snapped, and the team sprang into action. They began working the control panels, typing commands into consoles, trying to analyze the incoming signal. The ship was too far away to make out clearly, but the pattern was unmistakable. It was a deliberate approach. And the frequency it was emitting, the frequency Jonas had first detected last night, was not a random cosmic signal. It was a signal designed to communicate. The worst part? They had no idea who was sending it. Jonas was a scientist, not a diplomat. He had no training in dealing with extraterrestrial visitors. But the truth was, he was the only one who could understand what was happening. Levitas wasn't just a technological marvel anymore. It was a beacon. And the universe had taken notice that he had created something so powerful that it was no longer just his own. Levitas had drawn attention, and now it was attracting a force far beyond anything Jonas had prepared for. For the next few hours, Jonas and his team worked feverishly to track the alien ship's progress. The signal was growing stronger with each passing minute. Finally, they received confirmation. The ship had arrived. It was unlike anything Jonas had ever imagined. The ship was enormous, an almost organic shape, rippling with an energy that seemed to bend the very fabric of space around it. It wasn't mechanical. It didn't look like something built. It looked alive. As if it were part of the stars themselves. It hovered just beyond the reach of Levitas, a vast shadow hanging in the sky. The lights of the ship flickered once, twice, before it began to pulse in a rhythmic pattern. Jonas could feel it in his bones, the pull of the energy. He could tell it was calling to him. But what did they want? Valerie turned to Jonas, her face pale. "We can't just ignore this, Jonas. They're here. And they want what we've got." Jonas rubbed his temples, his mind spinning. He had always imagined that his discovery would change the world. He never imagined it would bring about a confrontation with beings from another galaxy. "What do they want?" he muttered. "I think we both know what they want," Valerie said quietly. "They want the anti-gravity tech." Jonas felt a cold sweat break out along his neck. He had built Levitas with the hope of creating a better future for Earth, a place where people could escape the weight of their problems. But now it seemed as if that very technology had drawn the attention of something far more dangerous, the Zarkari. That was what the alien ship's frequency was telling them. Zarkari, an ancient race that had been rumored to exist for millennia, watching Earth from the shadows. Jonas had heard whispers of them in some of the more obscure scientific journals, but he had never taken them seriously. They were just myths. Just stories. Now, Jonas knew better. A low, vibrating hum echoed through Levitas as the alien ship powered up its engines. The city's gravity fields wobbled. Buildings shook. The once pristine sky began to ripple with strange energy patterns, as if the very atmosphere was bending under the pressure of the alien presence. "I can't hold this," one of the engineers shouted. "The city's not stable enough to handle this much energy." Jonas's heart raced. Levitas was in danger. His beautiful city, his dream, was crumbling under the weight of its own success. The anti-gravity technology that had been the source of all his accomplishments was now the thing that could destroy everything. "We have to do something," Valerie said, her voice urgent. "We can't just wait for them to come down here and take what they want." Jonas nodded, his mind working furiously. But he had no idea how to fight back against an alien race with technology that far outstripped anything humanity had ever known. "Get me a communicator," Jonas ordered. "I'm going to talk to them." Valerie stared at him. "What are you going to say?" "I don't know yet," Jonas said, swallowing hard. "But I'm going to try." A few moments later, a small communication device was handed to Jonas. He held it up, staring at the strange symbols flickering on its screen. He didn't know how to communicate with them, but he had to try it out. He pressed a button, the screen flickered, and a voice, deep and resonant, came through. It wasn't a language Jonas recognized. It sounded like nothing he had ever heard, partly mechanical, partly organic, but Jonas had no time to waste on the unknown. "I know what you want," Jonas said, his voice shaky but firm. "But you can't have it. This city isn't for war. It's not for conquest. It's for peace. It's a symbol of what humanity can achieve if we work together." The voice on the other end paused, then responded, its tone still cryptic but carrying a distinct undertone of amusement. "You speak of peace, human," the voice said, "but you have created a weapon. A weapon we need. And now, we will take it." Jonas's heart dropped. The Zarkari had spoken the truth. The technology he had created had become something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Levitas wasn't a city. It was a target. "We're not giving it to you," Jonas said, trying to sound braver than he felt. The alien voice echoed through the communicator. "Then, human," it said, "prepare for war." Jonas's pulse quickened as the alien voice faded out, leaving a ringing silence behind. He stood there, the communicator still pressed to his ear, the weight of the Zarkari's words sinking into him. "Prepare for war." The words echoed in his mind, amplifying his sense of impending doom. For a moment, it felt like the world around him had ceased to exist. All he could hear was the mechanical hum of Levitas' anti-gravity engines struggling to stay stable. But then, as if pulled out of a trance, Jonas snapped back to reality. He could feel the cold, tingling sweat at his neck, the thick, oppressive air in the control room. Panic was spreading like wildfire among the engineers and residents of Levitas. "We need a plan," Valerie's voice cut through the chaos, but Jonas didn't know where to begin. He had never intended to lead a war. Hell, he wasn't even sure how to keep a floating city from crashing to the ground. But now, the world wasn't just questioning his genius, it was asking him to defend it. "Against an alien invasion, Jonas," Valerie said, her voice urgent. "We've got to move fast. The gravity wells are destabilizing. The Zarkari are already preparing for their next move." Jonas turned to look at the main display. It showed the alien ship now in full form, looming large against the backdrop of space, its shape impossible to comprehend fully. It wasn't just a ship. It was an organism, alive and seemingly pulsing with energy. Each movement it made sent ripples through the atmosphere around Levitas, distorting reality like waves across a pond. "How long until they reach us?" Jonas asked, though he already knew the answer. "A few hours, maybe less," Valerie said. She was already at her console, her hands flying over the keyboard. "We can try to power up the defensive systems, but they're not designed to withstand something like this. The Zarkari are too advanced." Jonas swallowed hard. He was already thinking about the anti-gravity generator, the core of everything. The device he had built as a marvel, as a gift to humanity, had now become a weapon that could either save or destroy them. It was too powerful, too important, and the Zarkari wanted it. They were willing to take Levitas, his city, by force to get it. The panic among the residents had already begun to spread. People were talking about fleeing, some of them already packing bags and preparing for a hasty departure. Jonas could hear the murmurs of fear echoing through the corridors. He wasn't the right person to lead a battle. He was the guy who created the mess, who couldn't even keep his coffee from spilling all over his notes. But in this moment, Jonas realized something that terrified him: there was no one else. He was the only one who knew how to use the technology, the only one who had built Levitas. And now, he was going to have to fight for it. "We can't let them take the city," Jonas said, his voice steadier than he felt. He turned to Valerie, the one person he trusted most in this crisis. "Do we have any options? Any chance of stopping them?" Valerie paused, her fingers hovering above the keyboard, then finally pressed a few keys. A map of Levitas appeared on the screen, outlining the major structures, the floating sectors that made up the city. "We have two options," she said, pulling up a diagram of the city's energy systems. "We can try to amplify the anti-gravity field, use it to make Levitas unpredictable, force them to chase us, or we can overload the core. But both options come with consequences." Jonas' heart sank. Overloading the core would mean the city would come crashing down, but it could also destabilize the alien ship systems long enough for them to escape. On the other hand, amplifying the anti-gravity field might cause Levitas to become even more unstable, but it could also give them a chance to outmaneuver the Zarkari. The first option was risky, the second was desperate. Neither seemed like a good idea. "You're telling me we don't have a way out that doesn't involve us all dying?" Jonas asked, incredulous. "I'm afraid not," Valerie replied quietly, not meeting his eyes. "But we do have one other thing. I've been tinkering with the city's communication system. It's possible we can send out a signal to other factions in the galaxy. Maybe there's someone who can help us." "Someone who would help us?" Jonas asked. "I didn't exactly make any friends when I invented anti-gravity. Most people think I'm a madman, remember? I'm just saying it's an option," Valerie said, her tone firm but also tinged with desperation. She looked up at him, meeting his eyes. "Jonas, we have to try something. The Zarkari are on their way. They won't be here for much longer." The weight of the moment settled on Jonas. Everything had led to this. The city, the technology, the lives of the people who had followed him, all hinged on one decision. He wasn't ready for war. But there wasn't a choice anymore. Not when everything he had created, everything he had worked for, was at risk of being torn apart. "Start preparing the amplification," Jonas said, making a snap decision. "But hold off on the overload. Let's see if we can make it work." Valerie nodded and got to work. Meanwhile, Jonas turned to his team of engineers. They had their hands full, trying to stabilize Levitas' gravity fields as the ship loomed closer. Each person worked with a grim determination, knowing the clock was ticking down, but Jonas wasn't going to sit around and wait. He knew that Levitas was not just a city, it was a symbol. A symbol of hope, of human potential. If he let the Zarkari take it from him, what would it mean for the future of humanity? What message would that send? He couldn't let them win. Not without a fight, Jonas took a deep breath and walked over to the communications panel. The Zarkari were on their way. If they could hear him now, if they could understand him, he had to say something. He had to buy them time. Jonas gripped the communicator. He didn't know if it would do any good, but he had to try. "This is Jonas Carmichael, leader of Levitas," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "I know why you're here. And I won't give you the anti-gravity technology. You want it, but it's not yours. Levitas is a place for peace, not war. You will not take it from us." For a moment, there was nothing. No response. Just the unsettling silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Jonas' heart raced as he awaited the reply. Then, the voice returned, cold and metallic as ever. "Your defiance is futile, human. You have no idea what you are dealing with. Your technology is an obstacle to our destiny. You will give it to us." Jonas clenched his jaw, trying to steady himself. This wasn't a negotiation. The Zarkari were beyond diplomacy. And Jonas knew, deep down, that no amount of words would make them turn back. "We'll see about that," he muttered under his breath. He turned and walked briskly over to Valerie, who had already started the process of amplifying the anti-gravity field. "Do it," Jonas ordered, his voice filled with resolve. With a series of rapid commands, Valerie began the procedure. The ground beneath their feet rumbled, and the entire city shuddered as the power levels surged. For a moment, it seemed like everything would fall apart. But then, as if by some miracle, the field stabilized. Levitas was now in a state of full flight, shifting in ways it had never done before, its architecture trembling but holding. The city was an unpredictable, floating beast. Jonas stood by, watching the strange energy pulse through the air. It was a gamble. A desperate, wild gamble. But it was the only option they had, and in the distance, the Zarkari ship began to descend, its shadow swallowing the city. The Zarkari ship loomed closer, its massive presence casting a chilling shadow over Levitas. The alien vessel was no longer a distant speck in the sky, it was here. The hum of its engines vibrated through the air, a low, predatory growl that seemed to reverberate in Jonas' chest. Levitas, now in a state of near chaos, teetered like a fragile balloon, shifting in space as the anti-gravity fields fluctuated wildly. The amplified technology had done its job, at least for the moment, but the instability was palpable. If they didn't act fast, everything could come crashing down. Jonas stood at the edge of the control room, staring at the alien ship as it drew nearer. He couldn't help but feel small under its shadow. A part of him, the scientist in him, was in awe of what he was seeing. But another part, the part that had built this city from nothing, the part that cared about the people who had put their faith in him, was filled with fury. "We have to do something," Valerie said, her voice tense but sharp as she worked the controls. Jonas snapped his head back to her. "We're doing something. We're not just sitting here and waiting for them to take us." She nodded, her fingers flying over the control panel as she tried to stabilize the anti-gravity fields one last time. "I can't hold this much longer," she warned. "If we don't act now, Levitas will be reduced to debris in the sky. And they'll get the technology they came for." Jonas knew she was right. There was no time for hesitation. The Zarkari ship was almost upon them, its lights flickering like some ancient, menacing star. He thought of the people of Levitas. The dreamers who had come here for freedom. The intellectuals who believed in a new world. The wanderers who just wanted to escape the suffocating gravity of Earth. The city was more than just technology, it was their hope. Jonas had created it, and he wasn't about to let it fall into the hands of the Zarkari. "Can we fight back?" Jonas asked, though he wasn't sure if he wanted to hear the answer. "There's no way we can match their firepower," Valerie said, her eyes glued to the display as the ship's descent became more deliberate. "But we can try to create a diversion, make them think Levitas is more dangerous than it really is. Buy us time." Jonas swallowed hard. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all they had. "Do it," he said. Valerie didn't hesitate. She began typing furiously, adjusting the frequencies, altering the gravitational fields. Levitas responded with a violent shudder, and Jonas could feel the pull of the city's unstable foundation beneath his feet. The platforms quivered, as if they could break free at any moment. But the lights in the city's central core brightened, flickering like an electric pulse racing through the heart of Levitas. It was a spectacle, a signal, bright and powerful, intended to draw attention. If they were going down, they were going down with a fight. "Hold tight," Valerie shouted, just as the vibrations grew stronger. Levitas lurched, the entire city groaning under the stress. Jonas's stomach twisted as he grabbed the edge of the control panel to steady himself. Outside, the Zarkari ship seemed to pause, hovering in the air like a vast, predatory bird. Its surface shimmered with an eerie, metallic sheen, and Jonas could almost see the alien intelligence assessing them. The ship's lights flared brightly, then dimmed, as though it were contemplating their next move. Did it work? Jonas asked, his voice tight. For a few seconds, there was only silence. The engineers were focused on their screens, waiting, watching. But the Zarkari ship made no move, no sudden attack. Instead, it hovered in place, like a watchful predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. They're scanning us, Valerie said, her voice low, almost a whisper. They're trying to figure out what we did. Can we hold out? Jonas asked. Valerie bit her lip. We might have a few minutes. Maybe less. Jonas nodded, thinking quickly. They didn't have much time. He had to make them believe Levitas was too dangerous to take. He needed a way to keep the Zarkari distracted long enough to either escape or find another solution. His mind raced, but he couldn't focus on the specifics. His instincts kicked in. Prepare the overload sequence, Jonas said, not waiting for a response. The idea was reckless. Dangerous. But if they overloaded the core, they could force the Zarkari to retreat. The massive gravitational force that would result could destabilize the ship's engines long enough for Levitas to escape. Maybe. Are you sure? Valerie asked, her eyes widening. If we overload the core, just do it, Jonas interrupted. We'll survive the fallout. They won't. Valerie hesitated, but only for a moment. She nodded and turned to the console, typing in the necessary commands. As the overload sequence started, the hum of the anti-gravity generators grew louder, vibrating through the entire city. The lights flickered once more, and the sound was deafening. Levitas began to tremble again, as though it were alive, responding to the threat in its core. Outside, the Zarkari ship's lights flared once more. Jonas could almost hear the alien intelligence calculating its next move. The massive vessel, which had seemed so unstoppable only moments before, now appeared cautious. The Zarkari were used to dominating, to taking without resistance. But Jonas wasn't giving up without a fight. He wasn't going to let them take everything he had built, everything he had worked for. We're close, Valerie said, her voice strained. The overload sequence is almost complete. Just a few more seconds. Jonas stared at the ship outside, willing the plan to work. They had to buy time. They had to make the Zarkari think twice about taking Levitas. The next few moments would decide their fate. Then, a loud crash echoed through the city as one of the floating platforms buckled under the strain of the gravitational disruption. The city shuddered violently, and Jonas's heart skipped a beat. The platform was breaking apart. The city was beginning to fall apart. We've got no choice, Jonas said, pushing past the fear that gripped his chest. Activate the overload now. Valerie pressed the final key, and the core of Levitas unleashed a burst of energy so powerful that it lit up the sky like a second sun. The entire city surged with power, and Jonas felt the violent shake of Levitas as the anti-gravity fields destabilized. It was now a ticking time bomb, and it was heading straight for the Zarkari ship. The alien vessel reacted instantly. Its engines roared to life, and the ship began to pull away, trying to escape the gravitational disturbance. But it was too late. Levitas had already begun its downward descent. The energy from the core overloaded the Zarkari systems, scrambling their ship's ability to maintain stability. The once imposing ship faltered, its lights dimming in a desperate attempt to regain control. Jonas could see the panic in the alien vessel's movements. It was turning, retreating, but it wasn't fast enough. Levitas, unpredictable, unstable, and filled with raw energy, began to descend toward the Earth's atmosphere, pulling the Zarkari ship along in a desperate spiral. It was a gamble. A dangerous one. And Jonas had no idea if it would work. The gravitational collapse could either send them hurtling toward Earth or create a rift in the space-time continuum. Either way, it was a ride they couldn't get off. The city groaned under the pressure as it plummeted. Jonas felt the air crackle with energy. The Zarkari ship struggled to maintain its distance, but the forces at play were too great. The two vessels spiraled closer together, locked in an unforgiving dance. The city's core was reaching its breaking point, and Jonas held on, praying the overload would keep the Zarkari at bay long enough to give them an escape, and then, with a deafening roar, the city and the alien ship were enveloped in a blinding flash of light.